What's the Grotte de Lascaux? It is a prehistoric cave in France which is known for the quality of its painting of animals. In what age were the Gothic cathedrals constructed? In the Middle Ages. Notre-Dame de Paris, Notre-Dame de Strasbourg, Notre-Dame de Rouen. The construction of the Gothic cathedrals was an extraordinary architectural, financial, and human adventure. Who was Clovis the First? Clovis the First, more often called Clovis the King of the Franks, is the first king of the Frankish kingdom, which later became the Kingdom of France. He converted to Christianity. His baptism took place in the year 496 in the city of Rheims, thanks to his wife Clotilde, and of course to Bishop Remy of Reims, about 20 years after the fall of the Roman Empire in the year 476. Clovis reigned until his death in the year 511. After his death, his kingdom was separated into 4 parts, one for each of his sons. He is the first king of France and also the first to conquer Gaul. It was he who made Paris the capital of Gaul, which of course was the old name of France. Who was Charlemagne? Charlemagne was born in the year 742 and died January 28, 814. He was a Frankish emperor. He reigned over a large part of Western Europe between the year 768 and the year 814, expanding this territory by several successive conquests. First king, he was consecrated emperor in the year 800 by Pope Leo III, who sought support to defend the Christian religion in these territories. Charlemagne is the greatest representative of the Carolingian dynasty, whose name is inspired by his. Who was Louis VI? He was called Le Gros. He was the son of Philip I, and he tried unsuccessfully to retake Normandy from the King of England, Henry I. Who was Philip IV? He was the son of Philip III. He tried to annex the county of Flanders. He fought against the influence of the Pope. He kept Pope Boniface VII in captivity. In order to take care of his financial difficulties, he confiscated the property of Jews and bankers before banishing them. He succeeded in seizing the wealth of the Templars. Under his reign, the Kingdom of France grew from Lyon and its region, as well as the Kingdom of Navarre, through his marriage to Queen Jeanne I of Navarre. Who was Charles VII? He was the son of Charles VI, and following the death of his father, he became King Charles VII, but could not be crowned in Rheims. The city was being occupied by the English. Joan of Arc, who delivered Orleans and led the king to Rheims in 1429, allowed him to assert himself as king. After the death of Joan d'Arc, he conquered part of the territories controlled by the English. He sent an army and resumed war in 1450. The Hundred Years' War ended after the English defeat of Castillon and the capture of Bordeaux in 1453. The English could only keep Calais. Under Charles VII, taxes returned regularly to the coffers and, thanks to the action of the Grand Argentier Jacques Coeur, the country experienced a great commercial boom. What's the 100 Years' War? It was a conflict between the kings of France and England for a century during the Middle Ages. This war actually lasted 116 years. Who was Jeanne d'Arc? Jeanne d'Arc was born in 1412 and died on the 30th of May 1431. She was nicknamed La Pucelle d'Orléans, the Maid of Orleans. She's considered a heroine of France for her role during the 100 Years' War and was canonized as a saint. Joanne said that she received visions of the Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine of Alexandria, instructing her to support Charles VII and recover France from English domination late in the 100 Years' War. The as yet unanointed King Charles VII sent Joanne to the siege of Orleans as part of a relief army. She gained prominence after the siege was lifted only 9 days later. Several additional sweet victories led to Charles VII's consecration at Reims. This long-awaited event boosted French morale and paved the way for the final French victory at Castillon in 1453. On the 23rd of May 1430, she was captured by a group of French nobles who were allied with the English. She was later handed over to the English and put on trial by the pro-English bishop Pierre Cauchon on a variety of charges. After Cauchon declared her guilty, she was burned at the stake on the 30th of May 1431, dying at about 19 years of age. In 1456, an inquisitorial court authorized by Pope Calixtus III examined the trial, debunked the charges against her, pronounced her innocent, and declared her a martyr. In the 16th century, she became a symbol of the Catholic League, and in 1803, she was declared a national symbol of France by the decision of Napoleon Bonaparte. She was beatified in 1909. Jeanne d'Arc has remained a popular figure in literature, painting, and other cultural works since the time of her death, and many famous writers, playwrights, filmmakers, artists, and composers have created and continue to create cultural depictions of her. Who was François I? He was the son of Charles de Valois and Louise de Savoie. He married the daughter of Louis XII and Anne of Brittany, Claude of France, thus bringing Brittany back into the royal domain. His reign is the golden age of the French Renaissance. Who was Henry IV? Born in 1553, Henry IV was the son of the Protestant Duke Antoine de Bourbon and the Queen of Navarre, Jeanne d'Albret, to whom he succeeded. He was of Protestant origin and his ascension to the throne was very difficult for him. He was narrowly saved from the Saint Barthélemy massacre in 1572. On his deathbed, Henry III, having no descendants, designated him as the next king of France. Being a Protestant, he was not accepted by the Catholic people. He did say, "Paris is well worth a mass." He was therefore baptized in the Saint-Denis Basilica. He promulgated the Edict of Nantes, which allowed Protestants to celebrate their worship freely, but within a certain limit. Henry IV will give peace to his kingdom. It is for this reason that he is named the Good King Henry, or Le Vert Galant, because he courted a lot of ladies in his court. Henry IV was assassinated in his coach on May 14, 1610, by François Ravaillac, a fanatic Catholic, in the streets of Paris. He was buried in the Saint-Denis Basilica. His tomb was destroyed during the French Revolution. Many believe his assassination was a plot by several Catholic dukes. When was the Edict of Nantes? The Edict of Nantes is an edict of tolerance promulgated in April 1598 by King Henry IV to put an end to the religious wars which ravaged the Kingdom of France since 1562, particularly the Eighth War, which began in 1585. This edict grants Protestants religious, civil, and political rights in certain parts of the kingdom, and in annexes called patentes, granted them a certain number of places of refuge, including about 60 places of safety, and guaranteed them payment by the royal treasury of an annual subsidy. Who was Molière? Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, known as Molière, was a French actor and playwright. He was baptized on January 15, 1622 in Paris, where he died in February 17, 1673. Molière's work, some 30 comedies in verse or prose, with or without ballet and music entries, is one of the pillars of literary education in France. It continues to be a great success in France and around the world, and remains one of the references of universal literature. Who was Louis XIV? The son of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria. He was the king of Europe, who lived the longest during his time. He is considered one of the greatest kings of France and Europe. Tired of the Louvre, he built the majestic palace of Versailles. Louis XIV loved art, and so he was surrounded by the greatest artists of his time: Molière, Jean de La Fontaine, Racine, or even Lully. He had 2 wives, who bore him 6 children, but also 13 mistresses, including Madame de Montespan or Madame de la Vallière. His reign was a golden age for the nobility and the clergy. The people, meanwhile, were the poorest. When he died, the kingdom's coffers were empty. What was Louis XIV known for? Louis XIV, known as the Great or the Sun King, was known for the length of his reign, 72 years, which is one of the longest in European history and the longest in the history of France. Who constructed the Château de Versailles? Louis XIV. What is the philosophie des Lumières? So the philosophie des Lumières is a cultural, philosophical, literary, and intellectual movement which emerged in the second half of the 17th century with philosophers such as Spinoza, Locke, Bayle, and Newton, before developing throughout Europe, especially in France, in the 18th century. By extension, this period was called the Age of Enlightenment. Through their engagement against religious and political oppression, the members of this movement saw themselves as an advanced elite working for world progress. The influence of their writings was instrumental during great events of the late 18th century and the United States Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution. Mention a couple of philosophes français de lumière: Denis Diderot, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Who were the kings of France during the Revolution philosophes? In the 18th century, under Louis XV, between 1715 and 1774, and under the reign of Louis XVI, between 1744 and 1792, the philosophers expressed new ideas, sciences, and also made tremendous progress. Who was Voltaire? François-Marie Arouet, known as Voltaire, was probably the best known representative of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. He was an Anglomaniac and very keen on the arts and sciences, complex character. His works were, however, not devoid of contradictions. Voltaire did leave his mark with his literary production and his political battles. His influence was decisive on the wealthy liberal classes before the French Revolution and at the start of the 19th century. Who was Diderot? Denis Diderot was born on the 5th of October 1713 and died on July 31st, 1784 in Paris. Was a French writer, philosopher, and encyclopedist of the Enlightenment. At the same time, he was a novelist, he was a playwright, he was a storyteller, a dialogue writer, an art critic, a literary critic, and a translator. Who was Jean-Jacques Rousseau? He was an essential figure of the 18th century. He was a rare bird, way ahead of his time. He was a great thinker of the Age of Enlightenment, which launched many new literary movements. Who was Louis XV? The great-grandson of Louis XIV. He succeeded him under the regency of Philippe d'Orléans, the nephew of the late king, until 1723. He died of smallpox at the age of 64, having reigned for over 58 years. The reign of Louis XV was very brilliant on a cultural level with the appearance of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, the philosophes des Lumières. Who was Louis XVI? Born in 1754 in Versailles and the grandson of Louis XV, In 1770, he was married to Marie Antoinette. He was the last king of the ancient regime. The state was deeply in debt, but he rejected all reforms that were proposed. Louis XVI had to convene a general estates meeting for May 1789, which triggered the French Revolution. He died on January 21, 1793, at the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Who was Eleanor d'Aquitaine? Her marriage to Louis VII having been annulled in 1152, she married Henry II and became Queen of England from 1154 to 1189. Who was Anne de Bretagne? Daughter of François II of Brittany and Marguerite de Foix, married first in 1490 with Maximilian I. It was a marriage by proxy, not consummated, and annulled in 1491. She got married for the second time in 1491 to Charles VIII. She got married again for a third time in 1499 to Louis XII, who became Duke, although his decisions were carried out in the name of the Duchess Anne. Who was Catherine de Medicis? She was the wife of Henry II and several times a regent, a woman of state. She had considerable influence under the reign of her sons between 1559 and 1589. Who was Anne d'Autriche? She was the daughter of King Philip III of Spain. She is the mother of Louis XIV the Great and of Philippe d'Orléans. She was the wife of Louis XIII. Who was Marie Antoinette d'Autriche? She was the wife of Louis XVI. Who was Josephine de Beauharnais? She was the wife of Napoleon I. What event regarding the French history strikes you the most? The French Revolution. Can you tell us the start and the end dates for the French Revolution? So beginning on May 5th, 1789, with the last meeting of the Estates General, so the assembly bringing together the three orders, the nobility, the clergy, and the third estate, to resolve the financial crisis due to the debts of the kingdom. It ended on November 9th, 1799, with the coup d'etat of Napoleon Bonaparte. Who was the king during the French Revolution? Louis XVI. What was the main event of the French Revolution? July 14, 1789 marked the capture of the Bastille prison, so the king actually locked up people without trial. The inaugural event of the start of the revolution was this very act. It took place following an agricultural crisis which gave rise to a great economic crisis and high inflation, which was confronted with decisions to increase taxes taken by the king. What does the 14th of July represent? The French National Day, also called July 14, is the national holiday of the French Republic and a public holiday in France. It was instituted by the Raspail Law of July 6, 1880, to commemorate the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, the symbol of the end of absolute monarchy, as well as the Fête de la Fédération of 1790, a symbol of the union of the nation. When was the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen? This declaration, sometimes abbreviated as DDHC, is a fundamental text of the French Revolution, which sets out a set of individual and common natural rights, as well as the conditions for their implementation. It was adopted on August the 26th, 1789. Who wrote the French national anthem, and why is it named after a city? La Marseillaise, which is basically a patriotic song written by Claude Rouget de Lisle during the Revolution in 1792. It was sung by the Marseillaise volunteers during their march to Paris. Who was Maximilien Robespierre? Maximilien De Robspierre was a French lawyer and politician born on May 6, 1758, and he was guillotined on July 28, 1794, in Paris at the Place de la Révolution, which is now Place de la Concorde. He was the main figure of the French Revolution and also remains one of the most controversial figures of this period. What purpose did La Bastille serve before it was demolished? It served as a state prison in which people like Voltaire were imprisoned. What is a republic? A republic is a mode of organization of a country in which power is exercised by representatives of the population, generally elected, and where the position of the head of state is not hereditary, and the head of state is not the only one to hold power. When was the First Republic? The First Republic was between September 22nd, 1792 and May 18, 1804. When was the First Empire? The First Empire was a period in the French history between 1804 and 1815. Now, during this period, there was an interruption of a few months, so between April of 1814 to March of 1815, when the return of King Louis XVIII, who was a Bourbon, caused the first restoration. Now, the emperor during the First Empire was Napoleon I. The First Empire was a very authoritarian political regime. The First Empire was also in continual war against the traditional monarchies of Europe, which wanted to erase the work and the ideas of the French Revolution of 1789. The First Empire revived the French economy following the economic issues resulting from the French Revolution. Who was Napoleon Bonaparte? Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, and died on the 5th of May, 1821. He was a French soldier and statesman. He was the first emperor
of the French from the 18th of May 1804 to the 6th of April 1814, and also between March 20 to June 22, 1850, under the name of Napoleon I. His reign ended after the Battle of Waterloo. Who put in place the Code Civil in France? Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804. It constitutes the statute of persons having the French nationality, their families, and their relations. Who ordered the construction of the Arc de Triomphe? In 1806, Napoleon I ordered the construction of the Arc de Triomphe in honor of the Grand Army. Constructions, however, completed under the reign of King Louis Philippe. When was the first restoration? The first restoration is the name given in France to the period between April 1814 and March 1815. It succeeds the First Empire and is replaced by the 100 Days, so that's the return of Napoleon I. King Louis XVIII returns to France and installs a regime which takes into account certain achievements of the French Revolution of 1789, but which reestablishes certain uses of the former monarchy regime. The return of the immigrants and their demands worry those who profited from the revolution and the empire. The new monarchy quickly becomes unpopular. In March 1815, Napoleon returned to France, where he had many supporters. What's the 100 Days? The 100 Days corresponds to a period of the Napoleonic adventure from March 20th to June 28, 1815. Napoleon I fled from Elba on February 26th. He landed in Provence on March 1st and in March 20th reached Paris, while King Louis XVIII had just left in a hurry. Napoleon then tried to re-establish the First Empire by giving it a more republican aspect, but the European sovereign declared war on Napoleon. Napoleon was totally defeated at Waterloo on June 18, 1815. He had to abdicate the second time. King Louis XVIII returned to Paris on July the 8th. Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. When was the Second Restoration? The Second Restoration is the name given to the political regime of France from June 1815 to July 1830. It succeeds the 100 Days and ends with the Revolution of 1830. It is a constitutional monarchy which has two sovereigns of the Bourbon dynasty, Louis XVIII, who ruled from 1815 to 1824, and his brother, Charles X, who ruled from 1824 to 1830. When was the Second Republic? The Second Republic was from February 24, 1848 to December 2, 1852. When did French colonization start? From 1830, the conquest of Algeria was accompanied by a colonization of population, forced by the need to supply the growing military forces with food. The French soldiers became colonists by settling and developing the conquered territory. Name 3 countries that were part of the French colonial empire. Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, Senegal. Who was Louis XVIII? Louis XVIII, born in November 17, 1755 in Versailles, was the King of France from 6th of April 1814 to March 20, 1815, and then from July the 8th of 1815 until his death on September 16, 1824 in Paris. He was overthrown during the 100 Days and then returned to power after the Battle of Waterloo. He died without any descendants and was buried in the Saint-Denis Basilica. He is the last French monarch to receive this privilege and also the last to die on the throne, the next 2 having been overthrown. His younger brother, the Count of Artois, succeeded him under the name Charles X. Who was Charles X? Charles Philippe of France, the Count of Artois, was born in October 9, 1757 at the Palace of Versailles, and he died on November 6, 1836 in Austria. He was the King of France from September 1824 to August 1830 under the name Charles X. He succeeds his 2 brothers, Louis XVI and Louis XVIII, as King of France, thus being the oldest French monarch on his ascension at 66 years and on his death at 79 years. What is les Trois Glorieuses? Now, the July Revolution was the second French Revolution after that of 1789. It brought to the throne a new king, Louis Philippe I, at the head of a new regime, the July monarchy, which succeeded the Second Restoration. This revolution took place over 3 days, July the 27th, July the 28th, and July the 29th of the year 1830, known as les Trois Glorieuses. What is the July monarchy? The July monarchy is the name of the political regime in France from July 1830 to February 1848. Constitutional monarchical regime established in France after the 3 glorious days, July 27, 28, and 29, 1830, and whose sovereign, Louis Philippe I, was overthrown by the Revolution of February 1848. The new regime was installed on August 9, 1830, after the 3 glorious days which followed the publication of the 4 ordinances and thus caused the fall of the regime of Charles X. From 1846, a serious agricultural crisis reduced the income of farmers, who were basically the vast majority of the population. For lack of income, they reduced their orders to the industry, and it was inevitable to lay off the salaried workers. A deep social malaise developed during the winter of 1848, and this promoted discontent, and this was the eventual downfall of the regime. Who was Louis Philippe I? Louis Philippe I, or simply Louis Philippe, was born in October 6, 1773 in Paris and died on August 26, 1850 in Clermont in the UK. Is the last king to reign in France between 1830 and 1848 with the title of King of the French. Far less traditionalist than his predecessors, he embodied a major turning point in the design and image of royalty in France.
Who was Napoleon III? Charles-Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, known as Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, was born on April 20th, 1808 in Paris and died on January 9, 1873 in the UK. He was a French monarch and statesman. He is both the sole president of the Second Republic, the first French head of state elected by universal male suffrage on December 10, 1848, the first president of the French Republic, and, after the proclamation of the Empire of December 2, 1852, the last monarch of the country under the name of Napoleon III, Emperor of the French.
In what year did men receive the right to vote in France? In 1848, with a minimum voting age of 21 years, and this was under the Second Republic.
Since when was France considered democratic? Since the establishment of universal male suffrage in 1848 during the Second Republic.
In what year was slavery abolished in France? The second decree regarding the abolition of slavery in France was signed on the 27th of April 1848 by the provincial government of the Second Republic.